Nearly a century and a half ago, the plant that defines France almost died completely. A disease nobody could see, carried in on nothing more than routine trade, spread through the country's vineyards for years before anyone understood what was killing them. Right now, a few thousand miles from those same vineyards, the team that carries that same national identity onto a football pitch is 3 wins away from a World Cup. Those two stories, separated by 150 years, are more connected than they look. This is the history of the grape in France, how a plant that isn't even native to the country became the single clearest symbol of what France is. How it was nearly wiped out completely just a few generations after reaching its peak of global prestige, and how the specific, unglamorous way it managed to survive says something worth paying attention to about what's happening in Arlington, Texas, this July. The grape story doesn't start in France at all. It starts in the South Caucasus, in what's now Georgia and Armenia, somewhere between 6,000 and 8,000 years ago, where wild vines were first domesticated and deliberately cultivated for wine rather than simply foraged. Archaeologists have found residue of fermented grape juice in pottery from this region dating back roughly 8,000 years, making it one of the oldest known winemaking traditions anywhere on the planet. From there, viticulture spread outward along ancient trade routes, into Mesopotamia, into Egypt, where wine became closely associated with religious ritual and elite burial practices, and into Phoenician and Greek port cities across the Mediterranean, each culture adapting the plant to its own soil, climate, and taste. The Phoenicians, in particular, deserve real credit here. As history's most prolific ancient sea traders, they carried vine cuttings and winemaking knowledge to nearly every port they touched, from North Africa to the Iberian Peninsula to the southern coast of what would eventually become France. By the time Greek city-states began establishing their own colonies across the western Mediterranean centuries later, grape cultivation was already a well-established, well-understood technology. Not a foreign mystery, but a proven system ready to be planted wherever conditions allowed. The grape didn't arrive in what's now France as a French invention. It arrived as an import, carried by Greek colonists who founded the port city of Massalia, modern Marseille, around 600 BC, and planted the first organized vineyards on land that had never grown domesticated grapes before. That's worth sitting with for a moment, because it's the same pattern that shows up again and again in this story. Something foreign, brought in from outside, eventually becoming so completely identified with France that people forget it ever came from anywhere else. That same instinct, taking something imported and making it unmistakably French, is exactly what's playing out this July, as a French squad built partly around players with roots well outside metropolitan France, including a striker with Cameroonian heritage leading the Golden Boot race, carries the tricolor through the knockout rounds of a World Cup, hosted, for the first time in the tournament's history, across 3 different countries at once: the United States, Mexico, and Canada. When Rome absorbed Gaul into its empire a few centuries later, Roman engineers and settlers expanded vine cultivation dramatically, planting across the Rhone Valley, into Burgundy, and eventually toward Bordeaux, following river systems that made large-scale wine transport possible for the first time. Roman law and Roman infrastructure, roads, trade networks, standardized amphorae for shipping, turned French wine from a local product into something that could travel, be traded, and be recognized as distinct from wine grown anywhere else. Roman writers of the period even began distinguishing between wines from different Gallic regions by taste and quality, an early echo of the terroir-based thinking that would later come to define French wine culture entirely. There were setbacks along the way too. A Roman emperor reportedly ordered vineyards outside Italy uprooted at one point, worried that provincial wine production was undercutting Italian producers back home, though the order was eventually reversed and vine planting across Gaul continued largely unchecked. By the time the Roman Empire declined in the West, the foundation for French wine as a defined, place-specific product was already firmly in the ground, waiting for the next several centuries of refinement. It was the medieval church, though, that turned French wine from a regional product into an art form with rules. Monasteries in Burgundy and Champagne, run by orders like the Cistercians and Benedictines, spent centuries meticulously observing which specific plots of land produced better grapes than others, walling off individual parcels with stone walls called clos that, in some cases, still stand today, and recording harvest results across generations of monks who would never live to see the full pattern their records eventually revealed. This is where the concept of terroir really takes shape. The idea that the exact patch of ground a grape grows on, down to the slope and drainage of a single hillside, matters as much as the grape variety itself. It's a distinctly French idea, and it's one that no other wine-producing country has ever quite replicated in the same way. The monks of Burgundy went so far as to identify individual plots just a few dozen meters apart as producing meaningfully different wine, distinctions that still form the backbone of Burgundy's modern classification system nearly 1,000 years later. This obsessive, generational attention to place over centuries is arguably the single most important reason French wine became the reference point for the rest of the world, rather than simply one strong regional tradition among many. By the 19th century, French wine had become the global benchmark against which every other wine was measured. When Napoleon III wanted to showcase the best of French production at the 1855 Paris Exposition, the result was the Bordeaux Classification, an official ranking of the region's top estates, based largely on the prices their wines had commanded on the market over previous decades, that, remarkably, still structures how Bordeaux wine is marketed and sold today, more than 170 years later. Only a handful of adjustments have ever been made to that original 1855 ranking, which tells you something about how completely French wine's hierarchy had settled into place by the time it was written down. French wine wasn't just good, it was the standard. Everything else, from Italian to Spanish to eventually American and Australian wine, was measured against what France had already established. That same sense of established dominance describes exactly how France arrived at this World Cup. Coming off a run to the 2022 final, a final France actually lost to Argentina on penalties after a dramatic 3-3 draw in regulation and extra time, which makes Argentina, not France or Spain, the defending champions heading into this tournament. This French squad still moved through the group stage with the kind of comfortable control that made deep tournament runs look almost routine. They took down Paraguay 1-0 in the round of 16 behind Kylian Mbappe, currently tied for the tournament's Golden Boot lead, before eliminating Morocco 2-0 in the quarterfinal to book a semifinal spot in Arlington. Morocco, for context, had just become the first African nation to reach back-to-back World Cup quarterfinals, which makes that win considerably less routine than the scoreline alone suggests. Still, France came through it looking every bit like what French wine had been for over a century. Not just good, but the standard everyone else in the competition has to measure themselves against. But dominance built on a single strength has a way of becoming a single point of failure for a vineyard and for a football team that doesn't yet know who it's facing next. In the early 1860s, vineyards in the southern Rhone Valley began dying for no reason anyone could identify. Leaves yellowed and curled, roots rotted from underneath without visible cause, and entire plots that had produced healthy grapes for generations simply collapsed within a season or two. The cause turned out to be Phylloxera, a microscopic aphid native to North America that fed on vine roots, and had almost certainly arrived in France on American vine cuttings imported by botanists and collectors who had no idea what they were bringing with them, at a moment when transatlantic plant trade was booming thanks to faster steamship crossings. American vines had evolved alongside Phylloxera for millions of years and developed natural resistance as a result. French vines had no such defense and had no idea what was coming for them. What made Phylloxera especially devastating wasn't just its lethality, but its invisibility. The insect lives almost entirely underground, feeding on root tissue and creating small lesions that let in fungal infections, which is usually what actually finishes off the vine. By the time a grower noticed anything wrong above the soil, the root system below had often already been compromised beyond saving. And by then, the insect had almost certainly spread to neighboring vines and neighboring vineyards, carried by wind, by irrigation water, and by the boots of the very workers trying to figure out what was going wrong. For nearly a decade, French scientists and vineyard owners had no idea what was causing the devastation, because Phylloxera works underground, quietly destroying root systems long before any visible symptom appears above the soil. By the time the insect was identified and understood, it had already spread across huge portions of French wine country, and containment had become effectively impossible. Estimates suggest that Phylloxera eventually destroyed somewhere close to 40% of French vineyards before the crisis was brought under control, and some regions that had produced wine for over 1,000 years came dangerously close to disappearing from the map entirely. On July 10th, in Inglewood, California, two teams are fighting for the right to be the obstacle standing between France and the final. Spain brings one of the most technically gifted young cores in the tournament, built around Pedri, Lamine Yamal, and Gavi. Three players still in their early 20s who anchored a midfield that dominated Euro 2024 with patient, possession-based control, the kind of approach that starves opponents of the ball rather than overpowering them directly. Belgium brings something considerably more direct and less predictable, a team that eliminated the United States 4-1 behind 2 goals from Charles de Ketelaere, built around pace and transition rather than sustained control. The kind of side that thrives specifically in the moments when a game becomes chaotic and unstructured. Nobody watching France's next match yet knows which version of danger they'll actually be facing, the patient kind or the chaotic kind. And that uncertainty is, in its own way, exactly what French vineyard owners were living through in the 1860s and 70s. A threat they knew was real, spreading somewhere just out of sight, without yet knowing its exact shape or how to answer it. A patient, controlling opponent and a fast, chaotic one require almost entirely different defensive approaches, and France's coaching staff will have spent the days before July 14th preparing contingencies for both, fully aware that only one of those game plans will actually matter once the opponent is finally confirmed. Desperate attempts to save French viticulture in those years ranged from the genuinely sensible to the almost absurd. Some growers tried flooding vineyards for weeks at a time during the winter dormant season, since Phylloxera couldn't survive prolonged submersion in water. And this method actually worked reasonably well, but it only worked on flat land near a reliable water source, which described very little of France's best wine country, concentrated as it was on hillsides specifically chosen over centuries for their drainage and sun exposure. The very terroir that had made those vineyards exceptional in the first place was the same terroir that made them impossible to flood. Other remedies were considerably less scientific. Growers buried live toads beneath vines, on the folk theory that the toads would somehow absorb the disease from the soil. Others dosed the ground with carbon disulfide, a chemical treatment that did kill some of the insects but also damaged and sometimes killed the vines it was meant to protect, and had to be applied with such precision and at such expense that it was never a realistic solution at national scale. The French government even offered a substantial cash prize to anyone who could find a genuine cure, drawing proposals from across Europe and beyond, nearly all of which failed just as badly, and in some cases even more expensively, than the homegrown attempts had. For the better part of 2 decades, it looked entirely possible that French wine, as a defining national industry and a defining piece of French cultural identity might simply cease to exist in any recognizable form. The solution that actually worked came, fittingly, from the same continent that had caused the problem in the first place. French vine varieties, the vinifera species responsible for every classic French wine you've ever heard of, were grafted directly onto the root systems of resistant American vine species, in a technique that had to be perfected and scaled up across literally millions of individual plants over the course of several decades. The visible part of the plant, the part that produces the grapes and defines the wine's character, stayed completely French. But underneath the soil, the root system holding it up and keeping it alive was now American. This wasn't universally accepted at first. Some French winemakers, especially in prestigious regions, initially resisted grafting as a kind of contamination of French tradition, and a handful of producers experimented instead with chemical soil treatments or simply replanting ungrafted vines over and over, hoping the pest would eventually die out on its own. It didn't, and most of those holdouts eventually grafted anyway, once it became clear there wasn't a viable alternative. What had looked, at first, like an unacceptable compromise became, within a generation, standard practice across virtually every vineyard in France. Nearly every bottle of French wine produced since the late 1800s exists because of a graft between something quintessentially French above ground and something entirely foreign below it. That crisis also permanently changed how French wine was governed. The chaos of replanting after Phylloxera, combined with a wave of fraud as desperate producers scrambled to fill gaps in supply with lower-quality wine, sugar-adulterated wine, or wine mislabeled as coming from more prestigious regions than it actually did, created a genuine trust crisis across the entire French wine trade. Growers in legitimate, historically prestigious regions found themselves competing against fraudulent bottles trading on names and reputations those growers had spent generations building, with no legal mechanism to stop it. That trust crisis eventually led to the creation of France's Appellation d'origine contrôlée system in the 20th century. Strict legal rules defining exactly what could be labeled as Champagne, or Burgundy, or Bordeaux, based on precise geographic boundaries, permitted grape varieties, and production methods that producers in those regions had to follow to legally use the name at all. It's a system that didn't exist in anything like this rigorous form before Phylloxera forced the issue, and one that other wine-producing countries have since studied and partially copied for their own regional protections. In a strange way, the crisis that nearly destroyed French wine is also the reason French wine became more rigorously defined, more legally protected, and more closely tied to specific French places than it had ever been before the disaster struck. Whichever team survives Inglewood on July 10th, France will face them on July 14th in Arlington, Texas, carrying a squad that, like the vines it's named after, drew part of its strength from well beyond its own borders, and turned that into something unmistakably French anyway. Spain's patient control and Belgium's direct chaos represent two completely different tests, built on almost opposite footballing philosophies, and there's no way to know yet which one France will actually have to answer come match day. But the deeper story sitting underneath all of it is the same one written into every vine growing in French soil today. Survival for France's wine industry never came from avoiding the threat or finding some way around it entirely. It came from adaptation, from taking something foreign, grafting it directly onto what was already there, and coming out the other side stronger and more resilient than before the crisis ever began. Nobody in the 1860s would have predicted that French wine's survival depended on American root systems, just as nobody watching France's earlier tournaments would necessarily have predicted a squad built this heavily around players with heritage stretching across multiple continents. In both cases, the thing that looked like it might be a weakness or an impurity turned out instead to be the exact source of resilience that carried the whole system through. Whether that same instinct is enough to carry this French squad through whichever opponent is waiting in Arlington is something nobody can answer yet, and it would be dishonest to pretend otherwise. Tournaments this large, with this many possible outcomes, don't reward confident predictions. But if 150 years of French agricultural history are any guide, betting against France's ability to adapt its way through an unknown, unfamiliar threat has never historically been the safer bet for a vineyard, or, perhaps, for whatever comes next in Arlington.